reviewing today the Iliad by Homer. Now, this is a reread. I had read this book way back in seventh grade, read it again in 11th grade, but hadn't read it since then. So it's been 30 years since I had read it until I picked it up a few months ago. If you've been following me on my weekly reading vlogs, you'll know that I reread this book and finished the reread, I don't know, two or 3 months ago at this point, it feels like. So I've been delaying making this video for a couple of reasons. One is that I've been very busy just with life and work and everything. So not a lot of extra time to film videos. Again, that's been in my weekly reading vlogs. But the second reason is I have so many thoughts on this book, and they're so confused and scattered that I was hoping maybe to have some time to sort my thoughts out. And even though it has been some time, I haven't really sorted my thoughts out, so this video could be a disaster. I do comfort myself, though, by thinking that probably only 5 to 10 people are going to watch this video. I say that because the way my channel works, when I initially put out a video, it only gets a handful of views. Certain book review videos do accumulate views over time, but those tend to be reviews of books that not a lot of other people have reviewed on YouTube. So they pop up in the search when people are searching for them. With a book like the Iliad, I am relatively confident that if you search for this, my channel is not going to be the first channel that pops up. I mean, there's got to be so many videos about the Iliad on YouTube. So with the knowledge that only a handful of people are going to watch this video, maybe I'll just consider this a little chat between friends. If I get a little rambly or disorganized, it's okay, right? Um, so with that in mind, I think I want to, I don't know. I was debating before filming this video how much to get into the whole Trojan War and how much to just try and stick to the actual pages of the Iliad. How much background to go into and stuff like that. And I think, I don't know, let me know what you think. My experience has been that as famous as the Iliad is, as much as it's a cornerstone of Western literature, nowadays, in today's modern world, there are a lot of people walking around who have no idea about the Trojan War or the Iliad. Educated people, but people who got educated in the sciences or in the IT or something like that. People who didn't study classics or literature in college. I could tell you so many stories about people I knew who were highly educated who just have no idea about it. So I don't know who's going to be watching this video, but I suppose I should probably give some background. So the Iliad is a long epic poem. It was, yeah, you can see, how long is it? Well, in this edition, comes up to 414 pages. So that is a long poem. Probably written somewhere around 800 BC. It's called the first extant work of Western literature. So I think there's older stuff like the Epic of Gilgamesh, but the Epic of Gilgamesh has not survived down to us. We only have fragments of it nowadays. So in terms of like one long story, the Iliad is like the first Western novel, except it's not technically a novel because it's an epic poem. So if you want to be pedantic about this and talk about the history of the novel, they don't usually consider the Iliad a novel, but it's got characters, it's got a plot, it's got a conflict, it's got a resolution. It was written in rhythm and meter and stuff like that because that's just the way they told stories back in that era. If essentially it's like a novel, and depending on what translation you can get a modern translation that reads just like a novel, and I'll get to talking about that a little bit later with this translation I've got here. Sorry, just adjusting the air conditioning. So yeah, it's a poem or novel set within the Trojan War. Now, the Trojan War is this huge event in Greek mythology in which many different stories are told. And the Iliad is only one part of the larger story of the Trojan War. So it's it's not recommended to pick this book up if you know nothing about the Trojan War. I actually, a couple years ago, maybe it was about 3 years ago at this point, I had this series on this channel, which I've since retired for good reason, where I would once a week try and film a vlog on a series on a subject that interested me. So I'd just pick a subject, something I had studied a little bit about back in school, turn on the camera and just talk about my area of interest. I've retired doing that for good reason. One reason is that most all of those videos were just rambling. And secondly, as it turned out, I didn't really have that many areas of expertise. Anyway, sorry. I'm rambling now. Before I retired that series, I decided to do one on the Trojan War. So I set up the camera and I filmed for 30 minutes and then the camera automatically shut off. I was using a different camera at the time. Filmed for another 30 minutes and camera shut off. And it ended up making 3 30-minute long videos in which I just rambled on all about the Trojan War. I'll link to them down below for the sake of reference. I don't necessarily recommend you watch them. I myself haven't watched them in years, so I don't even remember how well they hold up. No, I know. I can say with confidence they don't hold up well. It's just me rambling. But I give that as an example of how easy it is to get lost in all the background to the Trojan War. And I'm going to try not to get too deep into the weeds here, talking about what the Trojan War is and where this myth comes from and stuff like that. I already filmed a 3-video series on that already. But I do want to talk a little bit about my history with this and how I came to be interested in it, because I think that will end up being a good introduction for the Iliad. Hopefully this will all make sense at the end. So I have here a book from my daughter's book collection, The Wooden Horse, about the famous wooden horse that gets at the end of the Trojan War. Apologies, my camera is going to show everything in reverse images, so sorry that the text is backwards. But you get the idea. Not this book particular. This book probably wasn't even in print when I was a kid. But these types of books, these types of kids' books, illustrated Greek mythology, was my main exposure to the Trojan War as a kid, finding these in the elementary school library. So from these, of course, I knew the infamous Trojan horse story, where the Trojans bring the horse into their gates, but it turns out that the Greeks are hiding in the horse the whole time. And I thought that's kind of a silly story. I mean, come on. How could you be so stupid as to bring that horse into your city? And what wasn't particularly interested in it, it was not one of my favorite stories in Greek mythology. Um, to the extent I knew about Greek mythology. But I had a couple of cousins who one summer were reading up on Greek mythology, and they were telling me how interesting the Trojan War was. And I was thinking, well, it's just that stupid story about a horse. That's not very interesting. But then I was in the school library. I think I was about in sixth grade at this point or something, and stumbled upon a book called The Trojan War by Olivia Coolidge. No, I don't have that book with me. I haven't read it since sixth grade, but it was a big size book. I mean, it was written for 12-year-olds, so it had largest size font and some pictures, but it was a 300-page book all about the Trojan War, and I just looked at it and I thought, how on earth do you get 300 pages about this, this stupid story with the horse? So I was intrigued. I wanted to pick it up just so I could get the story. Um, so Olivia Coolidge's book, The Trojan War, if you can track it down, I recommend it. I mean, I haven't read it since sixth grade, but I have very fond memories of it. It's a retelling of the whole Trojan War story. So she takes all the different stories from the different sources and retells them all as one story. There's a little bit of summarizing and condensing going on, but the whole thing from the very beginning of the conflict all the way to the end and the return of the heroes, it's all there. And I read this book just with fascination. I mean, there are a couple of things that fascinated me about it. One was the violence. It's a story about war and a story about heroes fighting each other, and that kind of thing is attractive to 12-year-old boys. Who knows why? I've been reading evolutionary psychology lately, so I guess the answer I'm predisposed to is it's left over from evolution that we've got these violent tendencies. It's not a good part of human nature, but it is there, and it's all throughout art and literature and cinema. This fascination males have with action and fighting and violence. So there's plenty of that in the Trojan War. I'll come back to that in just a second. The other thing I was just fascinated by was the sheer scope of the story. How many heroes there were, how many different stories there were. Because the part with the horse is really just like the last chapter. Before you get to the part of the horse, there's all these different stories about heroes from the Greeks fighting the heroes from Troy and the gods getting involved in the war, and all these epic side quests that various heroes go on, and various armies that come in and join the war at different points. And it's just this huge epic. And the part about the wooden horse at the end is almost just kind of like a forgettable little ending. It's not really the main point. So yeah, just really fascinated by how much detail was in that story. No, I said I'd come back to the violence. The violence was absolutely fascinating to me, but it also was leaving me very confused about what the narrative intent of all this was. Um, because you had a lot of stories about heroes fighting each other that were clearly meant on some level to be thrilling, but you also the narration was also constantly making you feel sorry for both sides, which made it very difficult to completely give yourself over to the vicarious thrill of the violence. And I was, I mean, I knew it was intentional. I was a little bit confused by it. I don't know, even as a sixth grader, I guess I realized that this was some sort of cultural gap, between me and the ancient Greeks, and that I had been raised on stories that were morally unambiguous. The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien and superhero hero stories in which you enjoy the violence vicariously with the justification that this violence is moral and good and one side is vanquishing evil. Um, when, when reading about the Trojan War, you're like, okay, what am I supposed to feel here? Am I supposed to be enjoying this story or being appalled by it? It seems like we're going for both emotions here at the same time. It left me confused but fascinated. So I finished that book, and I I didn't realize when I initially read it how much was being summarized and how much was being condensed. I thought, okay, 300 pages. That's got to be the whole book right there. I mean, the whole story of the Trojan War. But the library had a couple of other books on the Trojan War. Unfortunately, I can't remember their names right now. They weren't quite as good. But I began to notice there were little details in those books that hadn't been in Olivia Coolidge's book, and vice versa. And then I got interested in Greek mythology in general from reading all about the Trojan War. So I started reading like Edith Hamilton's mythology and other books on it. Uh, and all the while, I knew that the Iliad was one of the main texts of the Trojan War. Um, but I was in sixth or seventh grade. Excuse me. I was in sixth and seventh grade, and I was a little bit cautious about plunging into this epic that was 3,000 years old and this old classic. Um, and was trying to read around it as much as possible. Read other books on Greek mythology, read other books on the Trojan War. But eventually, I got curious enough that I decided I did want to pick up the Iliad and give it a try. Okay, I know this video is 20 minutes long now, and I've just only barely gotten to talk about the Iliad, but I wanted to give all that background because that's the way to approach this book. So because the Iliad is starts right in the middle of the Trojan War, and starts with all the characters of the Trojan War as if you already knew who they are, you do not want to go into this book cold. Now, there are some other people on YouTube. I'm thinking maybe about Steve Donahue in particular, a couple other people, who recommend doing research on Wikipedia first before you attempt to read the Iliad. And you could. I mean, you could, but what fun is that? Reading off the cold Wikipedia page. I would recommend, if you're unfamiliar with this, but you'd like to get into it, Go on to Amazon.com and order The Trojan War by Olivia Coolidge. I'll leave a link to the Amazon page in the description down below. And read that. And if you enjoy that and you want to read more, then read a couple other modern retellings of the Trojan War. I mean, there are so many. If you dig around, there's so many retellings of the Trojan War that have been written for young adults, taking the stories from ancient Greek mythology and retelling them in very easy to understand language. Read some, because the Trojan War is part of Greek mythology, and because Greek mythology all ties together. Read some general books on Greek mythology. And don't think about it as homework or work. Just keep reading as long as you're enjoying it. I mean, if you're not interested in it, don't read it. If you read Olivia Coolidge's The Trojan War and you think, okay, that was interesting, but I can stop here, then stop here. But just keep reading as long as it's interesting for you to keep reading. And once you've read a couple different summaries of the Trojan War and you've read a couple different books on Greek mythology in general, then go ahead and pick up the Iliad. So the Iliad was originally written or composed way back in 800 BC. For an audience that already knew these stories. I was reading an introduction to Greek drama once, and there was a little something that stuck with me in that introduction. The writer said, when you go into a Greek drama, it's assumed that you already know the story. He said, if two Greeks are going to the theater, one of them would never say to the other, "Don't spoil the ending for me." They already know the story. They're just looking for the skill that the author has in retelling it. Now, that was an introduction to drama, but I think the same thing is true of these ancient epics. When the poet bard was singing at the dining hall, or however the story was being transmitted back then, everybody listening to the story had already heard versions of it before. So you do not need to worry about spoilers in this book. And in fact, as you're reading the Iliad, they're constantly making references to backwards and forwards. So there's tons of foreshadowing to what's going to happen, because the original audience knows what's going to happen. And there's tons of referencing backwards to events that have already happened. So don't worry about spoiling the story for yourself. By the time you pick up the Iliad, you should already know the whole thing anyways, through various retellings that you've read. And you're now just looking for that little extra level of detail. Now, the book I initially picked up from my school library, unfortunately I don't remember the translator, but it was a poetic rendering of the Iliad. And fair enough, the Iliad was originally an epic poem in ancient Greece. And I struggled with that for a bit. I think I got a couple chapters into it. You're not supposed to call them chapters in the Iliad, right? It's books. I got a couple books into it. And I could understand it all right, but I didn't like reading poetic style. It just felt like, I don't know. I'm not a huge poetry fan. It felt like the narrative was broken up by the poetic lines, the couplets, and I felt like I wanted to get at the story, but just had to try and get through this poetry to get to the story. So I never actually ended up finishing that book. I gave it back to the library after a couple weeks. But when I was in a bookstore, I don't remember, sometime later, I found a translation by Samuel Butler, which is a prose translation. Now that's, as luck would have it, that's the same translation I have now 30 years later. This is not the most modern prose translation. Samuel Butler wrote this way back in 1898, but it is perfectly readable. Read it in 7th grade and really enjoyed it. I have reread it this past year and remembered how much I enjoyed it. And, Samuel Butler, in his introduction, gives his excuses for why he's translating this into prose instead of as poetry. And he essentially says, I'm paraphrasing here, of course, but he essentially says, well, look, you could translate this into poetry if you wanted to, but what's the point? It's not the same poetry, because once you translate it from Greek into English, then you're losing the rhythm and the rhyme scheme and the alliteration and everything that made it poetry in the original language. So you'd have to just artificially recreate that in English. So why not just do it as prose? And he says, that's the way the modern reader wants to read it anyways. And I agree with that completely. Unless I'm studying ancient Greek, if I'm going to read it in translation, I just assume read it in a prose translation. Now, there are people who don't agree with that, who think, the Iliad was an epic poem, you have to read it as a poem. Okay, fair enough, but again, if I can give some advice here, don't read it as a poem the first time. Assuming that you agree with me that poetry is a little bit harder to digest than prose, the first time you pull the Iliad down, get a prose translation so you can absorb its content first. And then, if you want to go back to it a second time, then get the poetry translation the second time. But I think you don't want to make this any harder than it needs to be. You can just keep going in little gradual steps each time. Take a prose translation, something easy to read. If you like it, then try the poetry translation the next time. But yeah, I read the prose translation in 7th grade and was enthralled with it. There was much more detail about the battles in here than I got from any of the retellings that I had read. I never realized just how much detail there is about the back and forth of the battles, where the battle will just rage on and you'll get just page after page of the ebb and flow of the battle, and how the armies are going back and forth. And it's fascinating reading to a 12 or 13-year-old who is, as most 12 or 13-year-old boys are, fascinated by these scenes of ancient battle. But that problem I initially mentioned about the confusion about what emotion the narrator is going for, I mentioned that as one of the problems I had with Olivia Coolidge's The Trojan War, and that is magnified much more in the Iliad, where there are these really epic scenes of heroes fighting, but then the narrator will slip in something like, these two brothers he killed were the only sons of their father, who loved them more than anything else, and he spent the rest of his days mourning their death. And just at the moment you're trying to immerse yourself in the battle and the excitement of the battle, the narrator will just drop that in about how these two soldiers who just got killed, their father was mourning them, and it just brings you right down, and you're like, okay, well, I guess I had been rooting for this hero, but now I actually kind of feel bad about what he's doing. And I was confused about it at the time, and I noticed it when I was rereading it over the past few months. I mean, there are definitely scenes where the author unambiguously wants you to feel bad about the violence. So I'm thinking about when the hero Achilles goes on his rampage at the end, and just turns into this bloodthirsty killing machine, and kills all these Trojans mercilessly. Even though Achilles is one of the main characters of the Iliad, when you get to that scene, I feel relatively confident saying this. The author Homer is not, you're not meant to be glorifying an Achilles' violence. You're meant to be appalled by that. Same thing when Hector dies. So that's one end of the spectrum. On the other end, I'm thinking about like a chapter like the Deeds of Diomedes. Is actually two books where Diomedes is in the fight, and he's just doing all these glorious things and taking on all these Trojans, and even fighting up against the gods. And it's just like a really epic, exciting scene. But then, yeah, the narrator will just drop in these details about how sad the families were when they found out that Diomedes had killed their sons. Almost every character who appears in the Iliad will get a little brief biography. Even kind of the very minor characters who only come on screen briefly before one of the bigger heroes kills them off. You'll get like as they're dying, you'll get a brief kind of biography of where they come from and how they were raised, and the parents who were grieving for them after they were dead, which humanizes things certainly, but yeah, also just leaves me confused about what's going on here. I mean, yeah. Sorry, I said I wasn't going to get into the whole Trojan War, but the whole Trojan War is really an odd myth. So it's part of Greek mythology, so the Greeks are the ones telling it. But even in the framing that the Greeks themselves give, it's a completely pointless war. I mean, it's just one Greek princess runs off with a Trojan prince, and that's what starts this whole long 10-year war. And the Trojan War has like this huge place in Greek mythology. I think I read at one point, I can't remember the reference now, but of all surviving Greek literature, half of it is on the Trojan War. I mean, obviously there's the Iliad, but there's a whole bunch of other dramas and other pieces of Greek literature that are on this Trojan War. So it's this huge centerpiece of Greek mythology, this huge epic that the Greeks had built so many stories around. And in the framing they gave it, that it's completely pointless. Now, I mean, you think nowadays. I mean, I'm thinking of here. I've got my copy of Lord of the Rings here, right? Uh, Lord of the Rings, of course, is the clear opposite of this, where there are pure good on one side and pure good on pure evil on the other side. And so, as you're reading this, you have no ambiguity about how you're supposed to feel. You're supposed to cheer on one side, and the as the other side gets defeated in the war, that's something that you are allowed to vicariously take excitement in. Um, with the Trojan War, I don't know what's going on. I guess is the short way of saying this. I mean, I've got a couple questions or theories. I mean, I wonder if Christianity changed some of this, because when you read the Old Testament, there's not a lot of moral ambiguity, right? There's God's people, and then there's the Philistines. So I wonder if that kind of colored Western civilization. I wonder how much influence Tolkien has had on the 20th century. Maybe that's just the big thing I can't get around. Or I wonder maybe if the Greeks were just unique. I mean, if I were to read ancient Chinese literature or ancient Japanese literature or ancient Indian literature, would I find the same ambiguity? Is it a difference between modern and ancient, or is it a difference? It's something that confuses me. It confused me at the time. Confused me when I reread it. But yeah, anyways, I should talk about rereading this. So I'm out here in Vietnam, in which the book selection is limited. For a long time, I didn't even think I would be able to find a copy of the Iliad out here. But then I found a copy, and as luck would have it, it's by Samuel Butler again. So it's the exact same translation I read in 7th grade. And as I reread this, there were one or two lines, or only one or two, but one or two lines that I actually remembered coming across way back when I read this as a youngster. I should probably one of these days read a different translation of the Iliad. A lot of people on BookTube talk about, I think it's a Robert Fitzgerald translation. Am I remembering that right? The Robert Fitzgerald translation is supposed to be the really wonderful modern translation that everyone on BookTube loves. But this was the one that was out here in Vietnam. It just coincidence that it was the same one that I had read when I was younger. Or maybe it's not coincidence. Maybe the fact that Samuel Butler published that in 1898 means that it's in the public domain now. So maybe that's why so many people are using it. This edition does not have any notes or anything like that. Somebody on BookTube, I'll link to their channel down below if I can find it again, was doing an introduction to different versions of the Iliad. And she recommended don't pick up this version because it doesn't have any notes. Fair enough, but if you do the way I recommended, where you read several books about the Trojan War before you get around to this one, and you kind of know the story backwards and forwards before you pick it up, as you should, then you won't need notes. You can enjoy this without any notes. But yeah, whatever you do, don't come into the story cold. There'll be too many characters and too many things that you won't understand. Right. So, I mean, rereading this, I found it just as absorbing as I remembered it. Samuel Butler wrote this translation in 1898, which was, 125 years ago now, but it still holds up. It's still really readable. I think there are some thous and these in here and stuff like that, but really modern prose for the most part. Um, Something that struck me as I was rereading this was just how long it is. Um, it took me a couple weeks to get through this on the reread. Uh, I know there are. I know War and Peace is longer, and the Mahabharata is longer, and stuff like that. But it's just still really long for an ancient epic, especially when you consider how most of the ancient epics did not survive into the modern era, right? Because parchment decays and gets eaten by mice. So, in order for something like this to survive into the modern era, it had to be copied and recopied onto fresh documents by monks in monasteries, and once you're into this and you're in the thick of the battle, where it's just going back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I thought to myself, it seems like it's a modern miracle. Sorry, not a modern miracle. It seems like it's a miracle this survived into the modern age, and that there wasn't a monk somewhere who thought, okay, I can cut out some of this battle scenes, because there does seem to be a lot of parts of the battle that could easily have gotten cut out. I'm glad it did not get cut out, because it's just so incredibly fun to read. But yeah, I just realized the length of how long it was. The audiobook, I've been listening actually to this translation on audiobook after I finished rereading it, just trying to keep it fresh in my head while I was still trying to do the review. And the audiobook, the one on YouTube, is divided into two parts. I think if I remember right, part one is, video one is 7 hours and video two is like 6 hours. So, like 13 hours. So that's like, because back in the ancient days, this poem would have been read out at banquet halls, right? So that would have been 13 hours. Then maybe they broke that into I guess they must have broken it up, right? Maybe that's why they call it book one instead of chapter one. Maybe they read a book every single different night. There are 24 different books in here. The other thing that impresses me is, so when this was composed, 800 BC, it was just as Greece was coming out of its dark ages. So they had been invaded. Their civilization had plunged into chaos with the collapse of the Bronze Age. And then the works of Homer, and I think Hesiod, were the first big works of Greek mythology to come out of the Dark Ages. But what's interesting is Homer and Hesiod, reading about 800 BC, show a view of Greek mythology that is more or less the version that we know it, the version that we know it nowadays. Now, I alluded to this earlier, but Greek mythology, it is there's a bit of a chronology to it. So you have like the age of the gods, and then the age of some of the myths, and then you have the age of heroes. Like Hercules, Theseus, Jason, and the Argonauts, and then the Trojan War happens directly after the age of heroes. So it's not happening in a vacuum. It's coming after this chronology of different stories. And Homer, writing in the Iliad, definitely places his story in that chronology. So the characters are constantly referencing back to their ancestors who had. Everybody in the Trojan War has some sort of ancestor who has some connection to the age of heroes. In some cases, it's a major connection. In most cases, it's a minor connection, like their ancestor fought alongside Hercules, or their ancestor was one of the minor heroes during this time. But so they're sorry. What I want to say is Homer is writing in or composing in a time when this whole tapestry of Greek mythology was more or less in place. And that's one of the fascinating things about seeing this book, how interconnected everything was. But I mean, even leaving aside the larger part of Greek mythology, the story of the Trojan War, just the Trojan War, is so incredibly complex. You have all these different characters. And there are, again, lots of parts of the Trojan War that Homer doesn't tell because he's only telling a small section of it. But it's obvious that he knows those other stories and knows those other characters. He's making references back to it. He's making references forward to it. He alludes to a lot of things that take place outside of the Iliad, but that his audience knows will happen later. There are some characters who don't get big parts in the Iliad, like Cassandra. She doesn't really figure in much in the Iliad, but Homer definitely knows who she is. She gets referenced. And then inside the Iliad, there's just a huge cast of characters. And, it made me think. I mean, I'm a huge nerd. So I love continuity, and I love getting involved in things like comic books where there's all these characters to keep track of and stuff like that. But I don't know what I would do without Wikipedia nowadays to help me. You say, okay, who is this character? Well, let's look up on Wikipedia and see what his history is, because I missed that episode. The fact that they had all this story and all this continuity and all these characters without Wikipedia to keep track of it all, in when Greece was just emerging from the Dark Ages, it makes you think about how central the idea of telling stories is to human civilization. Because at this time in Greek history, when they're just emerging from the Dark Ages, you would think that they would just spend all their energy on trying to survive and build more tools or store up more grain. But they have obviously spent a lot of time crafting this incredibly intricate world of mythology and narrative. And I guess it was before Twitter, so maybe people did have a little bit more time on their hands in the evenings. But yeah, there was something I just really appreciated immersing myself in at the time I was reading this. That this is one of the earliest pictures we have of Greek mythology, and yet in the age Homer was writing, Greek mythology was more or less complete. I think if you get into it, if you go into Wikipedia or stuff like that, there are some details in Homer's book that are slightly at odds with later versions of Greek mythology. Mostly small things, but shows that Greek mythology was pretty much intact by 800 BC. I'm now 50 minutes into this review, and I still really haven't talked about what's inside the actual book. So what's inside the actual book? Well, a lot of stuff happens. It's let's see, how much do I want to get into this? Actually, I take that back. I don't want to do a plot summary of the book. I just maybe want to talk about the feeling of reading it. So, like I've been saying, there are a lot of heroes on both sides, on the Trojan side and the Greek side. During the course of this book, Homer shines his spotlight on a lot of them. I mean, not all of them. Again, like I mentioned, Cassandra or some other characters who are only briefly appear in here, but most of them get some screen time. So there's a lot of different a lot of different characters and casts in this book, and there are lots of battle scenes. And yeah, the battle scenes are interesting. I mean, yeah. The other thing about this is the gods and goddesses. You'll excuse me, my throat's a little bit dry. I think I've drunken all my water. It's probably a sign I need to start wrapping up this video sometime soon. In addition to the humans fighting each other, the gods and goddesses were joined in the fight, which is another part of the Iliad that I found fascinating as a youngster and really enjoyed on my rereading as well. This will take on two forms. So sometimes the gods and goddesses will enter into the fighting directly. So that then they'll be fighting against the humans or alongside the humans, and that happens a few times. But because some of the gods are supporting the Trojans and some of the gods are supporting the Greeks, and Zeus has his own plans about these various schemes he wants to manipulate. Zeus is trying to control the gods. At one point, he forbids them from getting involved. So the gods are scheming and manipulating among themselves. Hera and Athena come up with various plans to thwart the will of Zeus. At one point, which chapter was this? At one point, the fighting just breaks out among Olympus. So, up until this point, the gods have been fighting by proxy. So they will foil each other's plans by supporting one of the human heroes. But then, all of a sudden, they just start attacking each other on Olympus. And that I thought was a really fascinating scene where the fighting breaks out. I don't actually now remember what book that was in. It was in one of the later books. But there are also just scenes here. There's a scene when Poseidon is going to join he wants to support the Greek army. So he's been holding off because he knows Zeus has forbidden the gods to get involved. But then when he sees Zeus leave, he immediately runs down from the hill that he's on, and he goes underwater to his underwater palace and gets his horses and his chariot, which I guess is underwater horses and underwater chariots, and then he drives them through the seas. And it says that the sea monsters and the creatures of the deep were running out of his way as he was driving his chariot, and then he gets to the beach where the Greeks are, and he puts the chariot and the horses in this underwater grotto before going up to join the Greeks. So those kind of details about, Poseidon's underwater palace and the sea monsters, even though they're just briefly mentioned, that whole mythical element to it, where it's not just a war story. It's also a fantasy with the gods and the goddesses. Yeah, that was something else I really enjoyed. And again, with the knowledge that I have now, that this is one of the first intact works of Greek mythology to show us how the Greeks envisioned the gods at that time. I mean, question I've always had, a question I had when I read this back in 7th grade is, how seriously did the Greeks believe this? Did the Greeks really did believe in Zeus and Athena and Poseidon and everybody at the time, right? So, but then they have all these stories about the gods fighting, and one god will win and the other god will lose, and I wonder sometimes, did they think it was sacrilege to tell these stories? I thought I remembered reading something way back when. I wish I could remember the reference, that Homer was accused of sacrilege by some of the ancient writers. I don't remember where I read that. But I wonder how much of this is serious religion, and how much of this is just entertainment. Although it is interesting. Sorry, this is a tangent, but I was reading this while I was trying to reread the Old Testament, and while I was reading Exodus and Leviticus, and they're talking about all the rituals for burnt offerings. There's also a fair amount of sacrificing to the gods going on in the Iliad, and talking about the rituals for sacrificing different animals to the gods in the Iliad, and slightly different cultures, I guess, slightly different rituals, but I guess that it was taken for granted by the ancient peoples of the Mediterraneans that the gods wanted you to sacrifice to them. It would be, I don't know, something interesting to explore, or read up on how far this idea of sacrificing to the gods was widespread in the ancient world. I have a feeling that I've just barely touched on all the things that are interesting in the Iliad. But I feel tired. I've been filming for an hour, and an hour is already far too long. Did anyone make it this far? Leave me a comment if you actually watched the whole hour. But I don't imagine many people will actually make it this far. So there's no point in continuing to just ramble on to myself. I'm going to finish the video here. Apologies for just barely skimming the surface of this one, but there's a lot to talk about, isn't there?